27 years after her 3 identical sons vanished into the Oregon fog, a mother sees a stranger wearing a sweater with a secret pattern known only to her family. It's a single, impossible clue that unravels a conspiracy of patient revenge decades in the making. The fog came first. It was a living thing in Port Blossom, Oregon, a daily visitor that crept from the gray expanse of the Pacific and coiled through the dense hemlock forests. It softened the world, blurring the hard edges of reality into a watercolor dream. On most days, Eleonora Jensen found a quiet comfort in its embrace. The fog was a shroud, a gentle erasure, and for a woman who had spent 27 years trying to forget, it was a welcome accomplice. But today the fog felt different. It clung to the cheerful colored lights of the Founders' Day festival, making them weep hazy tears of red, blue, and gold. It muffled the sounds of a local band playing a too-loud sea shanty, distorting the notes into something mournful. Eleonora stood at the edge of the town square, a statue of composure amidst the gentle chaos. She held a cup of lukewarm cider, the cinnamon stick floating on the surface like driftwood. She had been standing here for an hour, a dutiful wife playing the part required by her husband, Soren, who believed their presence at such events was a sign of healing. It was a sweater, a fisherman's knit, thick and warm against the coastal chill. The color was a deep, heathered blue, the color of the ocean just before a storm. But it was the pattern that made the air freeze in her lungs. A complex, intricate design knitted across the shoulders and cuffs, an 8-pointed star, interwoven with delicate flowering vines, Stjerneblomst, the starflower. The world around Eleonora dissolved. The music, the laughter, the fog, it all vanished, sucked into a silent vortex. All that existed was that pattern. Her mother's hands gnarled with arthritis but still impossibly deft, flying over a set of wooden knitting needles. The soft click-clack sound that had been the background music of her childhood. Her mother, gone 10 years now, had been fiercely proud of her designs. The Stjerneblomst was her masterpiece, a pattern of her own invention, so complex she never wrote it down. A secret she guarded jealously. A secret she had shared only once. For 3 small, identical sweaters, for her only grandsons. The man turned slightly, and the cup slipped from Eleonora's numb fingers, splashing dark cider onto the damp cobblestones. He was a stranger. His face meant nothing. But the sweater was a relic from a buried tomb, an impossibility made manifest. It was a ghost wearing her son's skin. He took his food and began to move away, weaving through the crowd. Eleonora's feet felt welded to the ground. A primal scream built in her throat, hot and sharp, but it died before it could escape. 27 years of silence was a powerful warden. She could only watch as the man and the ghost he wore was swallowed by the fog. The festival's cheerful noise rushed back in, deafening and obscene. She stood trembling, the cold seeping into her bones, the fortress around her heart not just breached but shattered. The drive home was a study in oppressive silence. Soren, having finally seen the look on her face, had bundled her into the car without a word. Now the quiet was filled with the frantic energy of his hope. It radiated from him in waves, thick and suffocating. He kept glancing at her, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for the right words. Eleonora stared out the window, watching the familiar shapes of the hemlock trees emerge and recede like specters in the headlights. "It could be him, El," Soren finally whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of his belief. "It could be one of them." Eleonora didn't answer. She focused on the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers, a metronome counting out the seconds of her unraveling. Hope wasn't a comfort. Hope was the cruelest torture. It was the thing that had flayed her raw in the first years, the false sightings, the crank calls, the well-meaning psychics. Each one had been a fresh stab in a wound that refused to close. She had learned through agonizing trial and error that the only path to survival was to kill hope before it could take root. "We should call the police." Soren pressed on, his voice gaining strength. "We can give them a description. I'll post a picture of the pattern your mom used to have in that old notebook. Someone has to know who he is." "No." The word was sharp, brittle. It was the sound of a crack appearing in ice. "What do you mean, no?" he asked, bewildered. "Eleonora, this is the first real anything. In decades, we can't just do nothing." "There is nothing to do," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the storm raging inside her. "It was a sweater, Soren. Someone could have bought it at a thrift store. It could have been a gift that was passed on. It means nothing." She was lying, not just to him, but to herself. She was trying to force the ghost back into its grave, to rebuild the walls of her fortress before the grief could flood in and drown her. He pulled into their driveway and killed the engine. In the sudden, profound silence of their garage, he turned to her, his face etched with a pained desperation. "Why won't you let yourself believe? Just for a second? Don't you want to know?" No, she thought. I don't. To want to know was to admit that there was something to know. To admit that for 27 years, while she had been learning to live with their deaths, they might have been living. The thought was a physical violation, a tearing of scar tissue so deep it felt like her soul was ripping apart. She left him in the car and walked into the empty house. Every room was a museum of a life that had ended in 1998. They had never moved. They had never changed a thing. The faint pencil marks on the kitchen door frame tracking their heights were still there. The small worn patch on the arm of the living room sofa where Lars used to rub the fabric while watching cartoons. This house was her penance. It was her daily reminder of her failure. She had been the one on watch that day. A foggy October afternoon, the air thick with the smell of salt and wood smoke. Soren had been out on a friend's boat. The boys, 6 years old and electric with energy, were playing on the town docks, their bright blue sweaters a beacon in the mist. She had been sitting on a bench reading, looking up every few moments. They were there. They were there. Then she had looked down at her book, lost in a sentence for maybe a minute, 2 at most. When she looked up again, the dock was empty. The silence that followed was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She had failed them. In the space of a single paragraph, she had lost everything. Now, standing in her silent living room, she felt the crushing weight of that minute pressing down on her again. Soren's hope felt like an accusation. If they were alive, what did that make her? The woman who had given up on them? The mother who had mourned her living children? She couldn't bear it. She couldn't bear the weight of Soren's hopeful eyes. She needed to prove him wrong. She needed to find a logical explanation for the sweater, a loose thread she could pull to unravel this budding miracle and restore the comfortable, familiar numbness of her grief. Her feet carried her, as if of their own accord, toward the narrow pull-down stairs that led to the attic. The air that greeted her as she pulled the cord was cold and still, thick with the scent of cedar and thyme. This was the tomb, the place where the tangible pieces of their lives were stored. She hadn't been up here in at least 15 years. With a deep breath, she ascended into the darkness, her hand finding the familiar pull string for the single bare bulb. The light flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows over forgotten furniture draped in white sheets, like a congregation of ghosts. Her eyes landed on a large, sealed cedar chest in the far corner. It was where she had packed away their things, their toys, their drawings, their clothes. Everything. Her heart hammered a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Just find the notebook, she told herself. Find Mom's old knitting notebook. Prove the pattern is out there. Prove it means nothing. She knelt before the chest, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool wood. The latches were stiff. With a groan of protest, they sprang open. The scent that rose from within was overwhelming. The faint, sweet smell of her boys, of childhood, trapped for 27 years. She rummaged through the contents with trembling hands, pushing past small t-shirts and worn-out sneakers. There were no notebooks. Her mother had never written it down. The secret of the Stjerneblomst had died with her. Defeated, she began to put things back, her movements jerky. Her hand brushed against something hard-bound and covered in leather. A photo album. She pulled it out, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't looked at these pictures since the police had returned them to her. She sat on the dusty floorboards, the single bulb humming overhead, and opened it. There they were. 3 identical, gap-toothed smiles. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. A lifetime of happiness contained in a few dozen glossy pages. Her finger traced the outline of a small face. Lars. He had a tiny chip on his front tooth from a fall. She turned the page. And there it was. The last photograph ever taken. The one the police had enlarged until the grain was the size of pebbles. The one that had been plastered on telephone poles and in newspaper articles across the state. Her 3 sons, standing on the docks, proud and small in their brand new starflower sweaters. The fog swirled at their feet. They were smiling at her. Her eyes, trained by years of searching for clues that weren't there, scanned the image again. The docks, the water, the pilings, and in the background, half hidden behind a stack of crab pots, was the unmistakable front fender and round headlight of a car. A dark green, boxy vehicle. She leaned closer, the album trembling in her hands. She knew that car. Everyone in town had known that car. It was the cherished, meticulously maintained 1985 Volvo station wagon that had belonged to the quiet, intellectual school librarian. The man who was so good with children. The man who had seemed to vanish from Port Blossom on the very same foggy week that her sons had disappeared. Mr. Hemlock. The world in the attic was made of dust and memory. A single bare bulb threw Eleonora's long, distorted shadow against a stack of forgotten furniture. It was cold, the kind of deep, still cold that settles in places untouched by the living. Her own breath plumed in the air. But she didn't feel it. All she felt was the impossible weight of the small, glossy photograph in her hands. A car, a dark green 1985 Volvo 240 station wagon. Her mind, a place she had so carefully swept clean of sharp objects, was now a minefield of connections. Hemlock's car. Hemlock, the school librarian with his soft voice and sad eyes. Hemlock, who had given Lars a special copy of Treasure Island because he saw a thirst for adventure in him. Hemlock, who had vanished the same week as her sons. 27 years of static, of white noise resolved into this one, terrifyingly clear signal. A floorboard creaked on the ladder. Eleonora's head snapped up, her heart seizing with the frantic terror of a cornered animal. "El? Are you up there?" Soren's voice floated up from the world below, thick with concern. She couldn't answer. Her throat was a knot of dust and unspoken words. He appeared at the top of the ladder, his large frame filling the opening, silhouetted against the warm light of the hallway. He looked like a man ascending into a tomb. His eyes scanned the scene, the open chest, the scattered belongings, and her, kneeling on the floorboards as if in prayer to some terrible, forgotten god. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle as he crossed the floor. "What did you find?" She didn't need to speak. He saw the album in her lap, saw the photograph she was staring at with such violent intensity. He knelt beside her, his warmth a stark contrast to the attic's chill. He followed her gaze. At first, he saw only what he had seen 1,000 times before, the image of his 3 boys, forever 6 years old. Then, he saw what she saw. "My God," he breathed. The sound was not a prayer but a curse. He leaned in, his finger hovering over the image, careful not to touch it, as if the photograph itself might burn him. Hemlock's car. That's his car. I'd know that dent on the fender anywhere, remember? Someone hit him in the school parking lot. The detail, so mundane and specific, was like a key turning in a lock deep inside Eleonora. It was real. This wasn't a trick of light or a figment of her grief-addled imagination. It was a fact. Arthur Hemlock's car was there, on that dock, on that day. Soren surged to his feet, his body thrumming with a sudden, explosive energy. "I knew it. I always said something was wrong about that week. He just disappeared. No one disappears." He began pacing the narrow space between a sheet-draped sofa and a stack of old newspapers, running his hands through his hair. "This is it, El. This is it. We're calling the police right now." "No." The word was sharp, cutting through his frantic energy, He stopped, turning to her with a look of pure bewilderment. No? What are you talking about? This is proof. It's proof of nothing, Eleonora said, her voice unnaturally calm as she methodically closed the album. The action felt essential, like closing a door against a howling wind. She stood, brushing the dust from her knees. It is a blurry photograph of a common car that was parked in a public place 27 years ago. That's what they'll call it. It's his car. And we are his son's grieving parents, she countered, her voice hardening with the memory of past humiliations. They'll see a hysterical woman who saw a sweater at a festival and is now seeing ghosts in old pictures. They treated me like a fragile, broken thing back then, Soren. I will not be that woman again. Not for them. Not for anyone. The original investigation had been a nightmare of polite condescension and sympathetic pats on the arm. They had interviewed Hemlock, she remembered vaguely, a day or two before he'd officially left. He had been calm, helpful. He had seen nothing. He offered his deepest sympathies. The police had moved on. She was just another distraught mother. So what do we do? Soren demanded, his voice raw with frustration. We just sit on this? We do nothing? No, Eleonora said, looking at him with an intensity he hadn't seen in her eyes in years. We do something, but we do it my way. We need more than a ghost. We need a map. The next morning, the fog had receded, leaving behind a world that sparkled with a clean, cold light. The beauty of it felt like an insult. Eleonora sat at the kitchen table, a full cup of coffee untouched before her. She had not slept. She had spent the night staring at the ceiling, the image of the Volvo burned onto the back of her eyelids. Soren paced the length of the kitchen, a caged tiger of hope and anxiety. He had aged a decade overnight, the lines around his eyes deeper, etched by the violent return of a possibility he had never truly let die. We should just drive up there, he said for the third time. To his school, just show up. And say what? Eleonora asked, her voice level. Hello, Mr. Hemlock. We haven't seen you in nearly 3 decades, but we think you might have kidnapped our children. We need to be smart about this. Her calm was a thin sheet of ice over a raging river of terror. But control was her only weapon. She had a plan, a series of logical steps designed to disprove the very thing she was starting to fear was true. It was a way of walking toward the fire while pretending she was only seeking warmth. The first step was Agnes Bjorn. She took her coffee to the small desk in the corner and looked up the number for the retirement village where Agnes lived. As she dialed, her hand was perfectly steady. Eleonora Jensen, what a lovely surprise. Agnes's voice was as warm and comforting as it had been when she was the head administrator at Port Blossom Elementary. They exchanged pleasantries, the banal talk of weather and health a surreal counterpoint to the frantic hammering in Eleonora's chest. Agnes, I have a strange question for you, Eleonora said, forcing a casual lightness into her tone. I was just thinking about old times at the school, and I was trying to remember Arthur Hemlock, the librarian. Do you remember exactly when he left? Oh, Arthur, of course, such a talented man. A terrible shame he left us, Agnes chirped. Hold on, dear. My memory isn't what it used to be, but I kept all the old staff records. Let me have a look. Eleonora held her breath. She could hear the rustling of papers on the other end of the line. Soren had stopped pacing and was now standing frozen by the counter, watching her. This was the moment. This was the off-ramp. Agnes would say he left 2 weeks before, and it would all be over. The sweater, a coincidence. The car, a trick of the light. She could go back to the gray, safe stillness of her life. Ah, here we are, Agnes said. Hemlock, Arthur. He put in his resignation on October 12, 1998, effective immediately. My goodness. She paused. That was the Friday. Oh, Eleonora. That was the Friday before your boys. Eleonora's grip on the phone tightened. Her knuckles were white. It was all very sudden, Agnes continued, her voice now softer, laced with sympathy. He'd received a rather large inheritance, you see. He told the principal he was moving up the coast to start a little philanthropic venture of his own, a school for at-risk boys. A maritime academy, I believe he called it. He said he felt a calling to do more, to help boys who didn't have the kind of strong family your sons did. Such a noble man. A noble man. A philanthropist. Founder of a charity school. Eleonora felt a wave of dizzying relief that was immediately followed by a cold undertow of dread. It was the perfect explanation. A man who runs a school for troubled boys would surely have a supply of donated clothing. A kind, noble man might have been given a hand-knitted sweater years ago and passed it on to one of his students. He had left before her sons vanished, but only just. He could have been visiting friends in Port Blossom that weekend. His car could have been parked on the docks for any number of innocent reasons. It was all circumstantial. It was all explainable. She had what she wanted, a way out, an excuse to stop. She ended the call, reciting the details to Soren in a flat monotone. She watched his face, hoping to see the same relief, the same acceptance of coincidence. Instead, his eyes lit up with a feverish new intensity. A school, Soren said, his voice low and reverent. Up the coast. He's had a school for boys all this time. He looked at her, and his expression was one of absolute certainty. That's where he is, Elle. That's where the sweater came from. We have to go. Soren listened to what Agnes said. Eleonora pleaded, a rising panic clawing at her throat. He runs a charity. He helps children. He's a good man. This is all a terrible, tragic coincidence. We can't just go charging up there and accuse a good man. I don't care if he's a saint. Soren's voice boomed in the small kitchen, making her flinch. I don't care if he's won the Nobel Prize. Our sons disappeared. He disappeared at the same time. His car was there. And now a boy from his school is wearing a sweater that was one of only 3 in the entire world. What do you call that? Coincidence? I call it a map. She saw then that this was no longer a choice. For him, the path was clear. His hope, once a diffuse, shimmering fog, had now coalesced into a single burning point of light, and it was pointed north. He would go, with or without her. She looked away from him, out the kitchen window at the calm, gray ocean. What was she so afraid of? The truth? Or the hope? For 27 years her son's ending had been a mystery, and in that void she had created her own narrative. It was a story of a tragic, swift accident, a rogue wave, a fall, something clean and final. It was a story that allowed them to be innocent and her to be merely negligent, a guardian who had failed. But what if the story was different? What if it was something uglier, something that had been allowed to fester and grow for all these years? The thought of that possibility, of what her sons might have endured, was a horror beyond contemplation. It was easier to believe them dead than to imagine them suffering. But then she saw it again. The Stjerneblomst, the impossible pattern. It was a thread, pulled from the past. She could let it go, let it snap and vanish forever. Or she could pull on it. She could follow it, no matter where it led, no matter how much it hurt. To do nothing now, with this knowledge burning a hole in her reality, felt like a second abandonment. It felt like looking away from the docks all over again. She turned back to Soren, whose face was a mask of desperate pleading hope. The fortress of her grief, already shattered, finally crumbled into dust. Okay, she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a gavel. Soren's shoulders sagged with relief. Okay? Okay, she repeated, her voice stronger now, filled with a dreadful, terrifying purpose. We'll go. We'll drive up there. She held his gaze, needing him to understand. But we are just looking, Soren. We are just there to rule it out, to prove it's all a coincidence. Do you understand? He nodded eagerly, too overwhelmed with gratitude to see the lie in her eyes. Of course. Just to rule it out. She knew, and a part of him must have known too, that they were not going to rule anything out. They were driving north into the heart of a 27-year-old mystery, chasing the ghost of a sweater. And whatever they found at Hemlock's Harbor, she had a sinking, certain feeling that it would not be a coincidence. It would be an answer. And answers, she was beginning to realize, could be far more dangerous than questions. The journey north was a silent pilgrimage into the past. For the first hour, Soren drove while Eleonora stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar landscape of Port Blossom, the cozy craftsman houses, the bustling docks, the welcoming storefronts, dissolve in the rearview mirror. It felt like watching her own life recede. The farther they drove, the more the coast highway seemed to shed its civility. The towns became smaller, farther apart, clinging to the cliffs like barnacles. The forest grew darker, more imposing, the hemlock and spruce trees crowding the road, their massive branches dripping with moss and fog, blotting out the sky. This was unknown country, a place of sharp rocks and churning slate-gray water, a place that kept its secrets. Soren, unable to bear the weight of the silence, began to talk. His words were small, hopeful sparks in the vast, quiet car. When we see him, when we see one of them, he began, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. We have to be calm. We just ask him about the sweater. We say my wife is a knitter. She recognized the pattern. Where did you get it? Simple as that. Eleonora listened, her own heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Soren was rehearsing for a reunion. He was imagining a tearful embrace, a miraculous return. She, on the other hand, was preparing for a confrontation. She was imagining a man with cold eyes, a quiet librarian who had hidden a monstrous secret for 27 years. She was imagining what it would take to stand in front of him and not disintegrate into a million pieces of rage and grief. What if he doesn't know? She asked, her voice quiet. The boy. What if he has no idea who we are? Soren fell silent. The question hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating as the fog outside. He had allowed his hope to sprint so far ahead that he hadn't considered the terrain. He hadn't considered what 27 years in the care of another man might do to a child, what it might erase. For the next hour, they didn't speak. They just drove deeper into the wilderness, the steady hum of the tires on the wet pavement the only sound. They were two people in a metal box, hurtling toward an answer they were both beginning to realize they were not prepared for. The GPS directed them off the main highway and onto a narrow, unmarked service road. The pavement soon gave way to gravel. The trees pressed in so tightly that the sky was reduced to a thin, pale ribbon overhead. After another 10 minutes of jarring, isolated road, they saw it. A high gate made of thick iron bars set into a stone wall. A simple, elegant sign was affixed to the gate, the lettering carved into a polished piece of driftwood. Hemlock's Harbor for Youth. Soren pulled the car to a stop, the engine idling. The name was meant to sound like a sanctuary, a safe port in a storm. But looking at the severe, impassive gate, Eleonora felt a deep, primal chill. This wasn't a harbor. It was a fortress. This can't be right, Soren murmured, his voice strained. This pristine, imposing entrance did not match the image of a humble charity school. It looked exclusive, private, and deeply unwelcoming. The gate slid open automatically, silently, as if it had been expecting them. The motion was so smooth and quiet it was unnerving. With a shared look of trepidation, Soren put the car in gear. The grounds inside were immaculate but sterile. A long, winding drive led past manicured lawns and perfectly spaced, severe-looking buildings made of dark wood and gray stone. The architecture was starkly modern, all sharp angles and large, dark windows that reflected the brooding sky like vacant eyes. There were no playing fields, no basketball hoops, no signs of the chaotic, vibrant life of young boys. The only sounds were the crunch of their tires on the gravel, the distant cry of a gull, and the rhythmic lapping of water against a shore they couldn't yet see. The air itself felt different here, heavy, disciplined, and utterly devoid of joy. Where is everyone? Soren whispered, as if afraid to speak too loudly. The place felt deserted. They parked in a designated visitor's spot in front of the largest building, which looked more like a corporate headquarters than a school dormitory. They got out of the car, the silence pressing in on them. A man in a simple dark blue uniform emerged from the building. He was older, with a weathered face and a polite but impenetrable expression. "Can I help you?" We're here to see Mr. Hemlock," Soren said, his voice unsteady. "Mr. Hemlock is not seeing visitors today," the man said flatly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, Eleonora stepped forward, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "We're interested in the school's work. We support several youth charities. We were hoping for a tour, perhaps to speak with one of your instructors. A boat builder specifically." She was improvising, the words coming from a place of pure, cold instinct. The man considered them for a long moment, his eyes lingering on their modest car. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "The boat-building workshop is the last building down by the water. You can speak with Leo. He is the lead instructor, but do not disturb the other students." He turned and walked away, leaving them standing alone in the unnerving stillness. They walked down the gravel path, their footsteps sounding impossibly loud. The path opened up to reveal a large, beautifully constructed boathouse sitting on the edge of a deep, gray water inlet. The craftsmanship was exquisite, a stark contrast to the cold, modern buildings behind them. This was clearly the heart of the school. The wide boathouse doors were open. The smell of sawdust, varnish, and the sea drifted out to meet them. Inside, bathed in the soft gray light from the massive windows overlooking the water, a lone figure was bent over a half-finished wooden skiff, planing a long, perfect curl of cedar from its side. He moved with an intense, quiet focus. They stopped at the entrance, afraid to break the spell. He hadn't noticed them. He finished his pass with the plane, straightened up, and ran a hand over the smooth wood. And in that simple, unconscious gesture, Eleonora saw her father, a man who had built boats his whole life. Then he turned. Time stopped. It did not slow down or distort. It simply ceased to exist. Eleonora's mind became a camera, capturing every detail with a horrifying, crystalline clarity. The dark, curly hair, flecked with sawdust. The strong line of his jaw, a perfect echo of Soren's. The dusting of freckles across his nose, a pattern she knew as well as her own reflection. And his eyes. They were her eyes. The same shade of blue-gray, the same shape. But the light behind them, the spark of life and mischief she remembered so vividly, was gone. They were calm, placid, and utterly empty. It was Lars. Soren made a small, strangled sound beside her, a gasp of air being stolen from his lungs. The young man looked up, his expression shifting from focused concentration to a polite, mild curiosity. There was no flicker of recognition, no sign of confusion, nothing. He was looking at his parents for the first time in 27 years, and they were simply strangers who had wandered into his workshop. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was soft, gentle, and a perfect monotone. Eleonora felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This was it. The moment she had both dreaded and, in some secret, terrified part of her heart, longed for. And it was 1,000 times worse than she could have ever imagined. We were told we could speak with Leo," Soren managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm Leo," the young man said with a small, practiced smile. He set his plane down neatly on a workbench. "Welcome to the harbor." Soren took a clumsy step forward. "That's a beautiful boat. You do incredible work." "Thank you, sir," Leo said, his eyes flicking down to the boat, then back to them. "Mr. Hemlock taught me everything I know. He believes that discipline and craftsmanship can build a boy's character." The sentence was smooth, recited as if learned from a manual. "Leo," Eleonora said, her own voice a stranger to her ears. "That's a lovely name." "Thank you, ma'am." Ma'am. The word was a slap. a gulf of 27 years contained in a single formal syllable. She felt a desperate, clawing need to reach out, to touch his face, to see if he was real. But she was frozen. "My wife," Soren said, his voice trembling. "She's a knitter." She couldn't help but notice a young man at the Founders' Day festival in Port Blossom yesterday. He was wearing a fisherman's sweater with a very unique pattern. Leo's polite smile didn't waver, but a flicker of something, confusion, caution, entered his eyes. "We receive many donations for the students. I'm afraid I wouldn't know about a specific sweater." "It had stars on it," Eleonora said, her voice barely a whisper. "And flowers. Stjerneblomst." Leo's brow furrowed slightly. He looked from her to Soren, and for the first time his composure seemed to crack, just a little. He seemed less like a man and more like a boy trying to solve a problem that was not in his textbook. I don't know what that is," he said. He took a small, involuntary step back, his eyes darting toward the path leading to the main house. He looked like he was searching for an escape, or for an authority figure to tell him how to handle this unexpected variable. "Mr. Hemlock is very generous. We are all very grateful for what he has given us." He said the name, Hemlock, with a reverence that made Eleonora's blood run cold. He was not just a teacher or a benefactor. He was a savior, a god. She knew then. She knew with a certainty that transcended photographs and sweaters. They had not just lost their son to a kidnapper. They had lost him to another creator, a man who had unwritten their child and written a new one in his place. This polite, hollow stranger was Hemlock's creation. "We should go," Eleonora said suddenly, grabbing Soren's arm. Her hand was ice cold. "We're sorry to have disturbed you." "It's no disturbance, ma'am," Leo said, the relief on his face palpable. He had been given an out. As they turned to leave, Eleonora paused at the door and looked back one last time. Leo was already turning back to his boat, picking up his plane. He ran his hand over the wood again, the same gesture she had seen before. She realized with a final sickening jolt that it wasn't her father's gesture at all. It was the gesture of a perfectionist, a man obsessed with control, with smoothing away every flaw until the surface was perfect and impenetrable. It was the gesture of Arthur Hemlock. They walked back up the gravel path, the silence between them now filled not with hope or grief, but with a shared, unspoken horror. They had found their son, only to discover he was a ghost, haunted by a man who was still very much alive. The gravel of the long driveway crunched under the tires as Soren reversed the car in a wild, uncontrolled arc. The pristine, oppressive buildings of Hemlock's harbor slid past the windows like the architecture of a nightmare. Eleonora didn't look back. She stared straight ahead, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were bone white. The image of Leo's face, her son's face, was seared into her vision. The polite smile, the hollow eyes, the practiced deference. It was a mask, and she knew with a sickening certainty who had crafted it. "That wasn't him," Soren said, his voice a ragged whisper. The car lurched onto the paved service road and he pressed down on the accelerator, driving far too fast. "That wasn't Lars. Did you see his eyes? It was like there was no one home." "It was exactly him, Soren," Eleonora corrected, her voice hard as flint cutting through his bewildered grief. "Don't you see? That's what has been done to him. That wasn't a person, it was a performance. Every word, every gesture was taught. He's a reflection. He's what Arthur Hemlock sees when he looks in the mirror." Soren shook his head, a visceral, violent motion of denial. "What do? We call the police. We tell them—" His voice trailed off. "Tell them what? That they saw their son who claimed his name was Leo and didn't know them? That a man they hadn't seen in 27 years was running a school?" It was still just the desperate theory of two grieving parents. It was their word against the sterling reputation of a philanthropist. "Not yet," Eleonora commanded, her mind working with a terrifying clarity born of pure adrenaline. The numb fortress was gone, and in its place was something ferocious. A mother's protective instinct, dormant for decades, had awakened, and it was demanding action. We need Hemlock. We need to see him. We need something more than the ghost of a sweater and a boy with empty eyes. They reached the main highway, and Soren pulled over onto the shoulder, the car engine ticking in the sudden silence. He slumped over the steering wheel, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a profound, shaking despair. How? How do we find him? How do we even get close? Eleonora pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with a purpose that felt alien to her. She typed Hemlock's Harbor for Youth into the search bar. The first result was a glossy website filled with pictures of smiling boys mending sails and navigating boats. The second was a news article. She clicked it. "He's here," she said, her voice flat. "He's here, right now." She turned the phone to Soren. It was an article from the Astoria local paper about the annual regatta, a massive maritime festival. Hemlock's Harbor was listed as a primary sponsor. There was a photo of Arthur Hemlock shaking the mayor's hand, a picture of civic duty and quiet benevolence. "He's at the regatta," Soren repeated, straightening up. "In public." "It's the perfect cover," Eleonora said. "A man hiding in plain sight." She looked at him, her gaze unflinching. Drive. The Astoria regatta was a riot of life. The air was thick with the smell of fried food, diesel, and the salty tang of the Columbia River. Music blared from speakers, crowds surged along the waterfront, and colorful sails dotted the gray water. To step into the festival was to step into a different world, one loud with celebration and joy. For Eleonora and Soren, it was a technicolor hell. They moved through the throngs of happy families like wraiths, their faces pale and set. They were hunters now, scanning the crowd, their eyes snagging on every tall, older man with distinguished gray hair. The cheerful chaos of the event was a mockery of the cold, silent purpose that drove them. Eleonora saw him first. Near a large blue and white striped sponsor's tent, a small crowd of people had gathered. In the center of them stood Arthur Hemlock. He was older, of course. The dark hair from her memory was now a thick, perfectly groomed mane of silver. He wore a tailored navy blazer and held a glass of white wine, his posture one of easy, unassuming authority. He was listening to a woman with a rapt, gentle expression that Eleonora remembered from parent-teacher conferences. He looked exactly as he always had, kind, intelligent, and utterly trustworthy. A wave of nausea washed over her, and then she saw the other one. Standing near the edge of the tent, arms crossed, was another young man. He was identical to Leo in every feature, the same hair, the same jaw, the same height. But where Leo had been placid and hollow, this young man was a storm contained. His face was set in a look of bored, simmering contempt. He watched the festival, the laughing families, the cheering crowds, with a cynical disdain that seemed far too old for his years. His eyes were not empty. They were full of a cold, banked fire. Niels. It had to be Niels, her son who was always the skeptic, the questioner, the one who saw through everything. Whatever Hemlock had done to them, he hadn't managed to extinguish that fire completely. He had only turned it inward until it became a poison. "Soren," she whispered, her voice tight. "Look, by the tent." Soren followed her gaze. He saw Hemlock, and then he saw the second son. The air left his lungs in a rush. "Two of them," he breathed. The reality of it, the sheer, audacious scale of the crime, was finally settling in. This wasn't just a single, confused boy. This was a stolen family. Consumed by a rage that burned through his despair, Soren started forward. Eleonora grabbed his arm, her grip like steel. "No, not yet. Wait." He needed to understand. He needed to reconcile the man in the blazer with the monster in his mind. He pulled away from her, not aggressively, but with the unstoppable momentum of a man falling off a cliff. He moved around the edge of the crowd, positioning himself behind a large sail-making display, close enough to hear, but out of sight. Hemlock was laughing softly at something the woman had said. His voice was exactly the same, a low, cultured baritone. Then another man, older and ruddy-faced, clapped Hemlock on the shoulder. "I still don't know how you do it, Arthur," the man said, his voice carrying on the river breeze. "Truly. To build all this." He gestured vaguely toward the school's banner. "After everything. After that terrible business with the Jensen fishing comber boat. To turn all that grief into something so positive. Well, it's an inspiration." The name hit Soren like a physical blow. Jensen Fishing Co. The world narrowed to a single roaring point in his ears. It wasn't his company. It was his grandfather's. It had been sold off 30 years ago before he had even met Eleonora. But he remembered the stories, the dark whispers in the family he'd been too young to understand. A fishing boat, the North Star. A sudden, violent storm off the coast in the mid-70s. The boat went down. 2 boys on board lost. They were the sons of a new accountant his grandfather had just hired. A quiet, intellectual man who had just moved to town with his young family. A man named Hemlock. He remembered the talk of a lawsuit, a claim of negligence, and a faulty bilge pump. But it had all fizzled out. Hemlock had dropped the suit, and not long after, had taken a quiet job as the elementary school librarian, a man quietly rebuilding his life. The past slammed into the present with the force of a tidal wave. This was not a random tragedy. This was not a madman replacing his lost children with the next available set. This was a debt. A blood debt. A quiet, patient, half-century-long vendetta that had been lying in wait. Hemlock hadn't just taken his sons. He had chosen them. He had watched them grow. He had waited. And then he had collected. A cold that had nothing to do with the coastal air flooded Soren's veins. He stumbled backward, away from the tent, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a horror that was deeper and more absolute than anything he had ever known. He found Eleonora, who had been watching his face, and she knew instantly that something had shifted. The ground had given way. "Soren, what is it?" He grabbed her arms, his grip bruising. He looked into her eyes, and she saw that the hope that had defined him for 27 years was finally, completely dead. In its place was a terrifying, bottomless abyss. "It was us," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Eleonora, it was always us, my family." He told her, the words tumbling out in a broken, frantic rush. The North Star, the 2 lost boys, the lawsuit that vanished, the long, patient silence. The final piece clicked into place. The horror of it was perfect. It was a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. They were not just victims. They were the target. They were the final chapter in Arthur Hemlock's long, cold story of revenge. The realization transformed them. Their fear, their grief, their confusion, it all burned away, leaving behind a single, terrifying imperative. They were not just trying to find their children. They were trying to save them from a man who believed he had every right to destroy them. Eleonora looked across the laughing crowd at the silver-haired man sipping his wine, the man who had orchestrated their entire life's tragedy. Her hand went to her pocket, her fingers closing around her phone. Her hand was shaking violently, but when she raised it to her ear and dialed 911, her voice was the calmest it had been all day. It was the voice of a woman with nothing left to lose, and therefore, nothing left to fear. "My name is Eleonora Jensen," she said, her voice as cold and steady as a surgeon's scalpel. "I'm at the Astoria Regatta, and I'd like to report a kidnapping. 3 of them, 27 years ago. The man who did it is here. His name is Arthur Hemlock, but you should know. He thinks it was justice." The world fractured into noise and motion. Eleonora's voice on the phone, a blade of ice in the festive air, was the signal that brought the hidden world of order crashing into Arthur Hemlock's carefully constructed reality. For a few long moments, Nothing happened. The band played on, people laughed, the river flowed. Then, she saw them. Two plainclothes officers, their faces calm and purposeful, cutting through the crowd from one direction. A pair of uniformed state troopers from another. They moved with a quiet, coordinated efficiency that was more terrifying than any siren. They converged on the blue and white sponsor's tent. Hemlock was in the middle of a sentence, a charming anecdote for his captive audience, when he seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. He looked up, his polite smile faltering as he saw the officers approaching. His eyes scanned the perimeter, and then they found them. Eleonora and Soren, standing beside a senior detective, their faces pale and resolute. In that instant, Hemlock's mask of genteel philanthropy didn't just slip, it evaporated. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a look of cold, reptilian fury. He knew. He set his wineglass down on the table with a perfectly steady hand. The arrest was brutally, surreally quiet. No shouting, no struggle. The lead detective spoke to Hemlock in a low voice, and Hemlock responded with a curt, vicious nod. Eleonora watched as they turned him and placed his hands behind his back. She saw Niels, take a shocked step forward, his cynical boredom instantly replaced by a look of furious disbelief. She saw Lars, freeze in place, his face a mask of pure, terrified confusion, his eyes darting around for an instruction manual that didn't exist. This was not part of the lesson plan. The crowd fell silent, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity as the respected philanthropist Mr. Hemlock was led away. He held his head high, a portrait of wronged dignity. But as they passed by, his eyes met Eleonora's, and in them, she saw no remorse, no fear, only a bottomless, chilling hatred. It was the look of a god whose perfect creation had just been desecrated by the clumsy hands of mortals. The Oregon State Police barracks smelled of stale coffee and antiseptic. The world outside, with its river and its fog and its festival, felt a universe away. Eleonora and Soren sat in a small, windowless interview room, a box of tissues on the metal table between them. They hadn't spoken since arriving, each lost in the echoing silence of the last hour. The door opened and a detective entered. Her name was Rossi. She was sharp, compassionate, and she did not treat them like fragile relics. She sat down and looked at them, her gaze direct. "He's talking," she said without preamble. "He waived his right to an attorney. He wants to talk. He wants his story told." Over the next hour, Detective Rossi relayed Arthur Hemlock's confession. It was not the story of a man broken by grief. It was the cold, precise ledger-keeping of an accountant settling a debt. He told them everything, his voice, according to Rossi, never rising, never cracking. He spoke of the North Star, the fishing boat from the Jensen Company that he blamed for the death of his two sons. He spoke of the insulting settlement his lawyer had advised him to reject, and his decision to pursue a purer, more biblical form of justice. He told them how he had watched their sons, how he had chosen them, how he had lured them into his green Volvo that foggy October day with the promise of seeing a secret tide pool filled with starfish. He detailed how he had systematically erased their past, creating a new reality for them built on a foundation of lies. They were orphans, he told them, survivors of a shipwreck where their criminal parents had drowned. He was their savior, their only family. "He calls them his projects," Rossi said, her voice laced with a disgust she didn't try to hide. Lars, was the success, the compliant one. Niels, was the disappointment. Too questioning, too much of his father's stubbornness in him. He could never break him, only contain him. Eleonora felt a chill spread through her chest. Niels, her little boy who always asked, why? "And the third one?" Soren asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Gunnar?" Rossi's expression hardened. Gunnar, or Gus, as Hemlock calls him, was the failure. He was the most defiant as a child. He refused to stop talking about you. He kept trying to run away. As punishment and as a lesson to the others, Hemlock isolated him. For the last 15 years, he has lived almost entirely alone at a remote cabin Hemlock owns deep in the forest. He was the example of what happens when you disobey the narrative. Eleonora closed her eyes, a strangled sob finally escaping her. 15 years. She imagined her son, alone in the woods, his spirit slowly, deliberately being eroded until all that was left was a ghost. "He's been charged," Detective Rossi said, standing. "Kidnapping, false imprisonment, abuse. He'll never see the light of day again." She paused, her professional demeanor softening. "But I think there are 3 people who have waited long enough to see you." She opened the door and spoke quietly to an officer in the hallway. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the small room seemed to grow louder, filling a silence that was thick with the weight of 27 years. Eleonora held Soren's hand, her knuckles pressed against his. His hand was cold as stone. The door opened again. They entered one by one, 3 separate satellites orbiting a sun that had long since burned out. The first was Lars, his face pale, his eyes wide with a deep, ingrained fear. He looked like a man brought before a tribunal, unsure of his crime. The second was Niels, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face a mask of simmering rage and suspicion. He glared at the walls, at the detective, at his parents, at anyone but his brothers. The last was Gunnar. He was thin, with an unkempt beard, and he moved with a shambling, disconnected gait. His eyes were not vacant. They were looking inward, at a landscape no one else could see. They were men, grown men with weathered hands and lines of hardship etched around their eyes. But to Eleonora, they were still 6 years old, trapped in amber. For a long moment, nobody moved. It was a tableau of impossible distance, a lifetime of missed birthdays, of scraped knees, of graduations and heartbreaks stood between them like an invisible wall of glass. Eleonora rose from her chair. The movement was slow, fragile, as if her bones might turn to dust. She took one step, then another. Soren stood beside her, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. He had dreamed of this moment, but his dreams had never prepared him for the crushing, silent weight of this reality. "My boys," Eleonora whispered. The words were not a joyful exclamation, but a breath of pure, unadulterated pain. Something in her voice, a note of primal, foundational grief, seemed to cut through the silence. Lars flinched, his eyes finally meeting hers. For a split second she saw a flicker of something beyond the fear, a deep, ancient confusion, the ghost of a memory. Niels's mask of anger cracked, his jaw tightening as he fought against an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. Gunnar incredibly turned his head slightly, his gaze shifting from the interior of his own mind to the woman standing before him. Eleonora took one more step. She was close enough now to see the small pale scar above Lars's eyebrow, where he had fallen from a swing. She lifted her hand, not to embrace him, not to pull him to her, but simply to bridge the chasm. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, slowly, tentatively, and laid them on the sleeve of his jacket. He flinched. It was a small, sharp, involuntary jerk, a recoiling from a foreign touch, a lifetime of conditioning rising up to protect him from the very person he was born from. The gesture was a universe of pain. It was the answer to every question she had been afraid to ask. But he didn't pull away. He stood rigid, his body trembling, and allowed her hand to rest there. The mystery of what happened to the Jensen boys was over. The case was closed. But standing in the harsh, humming light of the police station, with her hand on the arm of a son who was a stranger, surrounded by the wreckage of 3 stolen lives, Eleonora knew that the real mystery had just begun. How do you rebuild a family from ashes? How do you convince a soul that it is not an orphan? She looked from one broken son to the next, and in the profound, terrifying silence, she felt the first fragile and impossibly heavy weight of the answer, one slow, painful, uncertain moment at a time.